welcome to the special topics in media course experience. Our emphasis in this course, future shock science fiction, where we are examining the not only genre of science fiction as a broad area of entertainment, but also ideas, literary ideas, but also popular ideas. But within science fiction, the subgenre that is quite lucrative, quite expressive to many of our needs or perhaps anxieties of the day. And interestingly enough, when I say of the day, it is a little bit tongue-in-cheek because these anxieties manifest over time, and despite the passage of time, these themes still remain resonant with us. And so we've observed that through each of our first screenings and subsequent discussions in this course. We looked at 1973's Soylent Green and the kind of bio warnings that it suggests and the kind of dystopic endings, right? Nihilistic endings that could occur, right? They are potentialities if we are not too careful. As we moved into week 2, we examined if biohazards were a concern in week 1, then the outright outcomes of a post-nuclear wasteland became a focus area. And through that, we looked at or examined the world of Mad Max and that film series from George Miller, looking at Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, the capper in what was for a while, for a time, considered a trilogy of anthology-esque tales, a bit of world building and myth making, but it has since continued to build and expand, right, as the director returned to his property many years later with the highly revered Mad Max Fury Road. This week, we are turning the dial yet again and looking at an entirely new theme and what should be a very familiar topic of both science fiction and future shock for you, the topic of technology, and technology specifically as it relates to creation and this idea of artificial life. As long as science fiction reaches back, science fiction from its literary origins has spotlighted creation or artificial creation and asked questions about what it means to be of life or to gain humanity. And rereading the early chapters in this book, or looking at those historical chapters, which is the middle of Keith Johnston's science fiction film book, discusses at length the creation as a central unit in early science fiction, in books and in features like, or derivative of, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And so creation and humanity are themes that we often come across time and again. They're recurring, and they will recur again this evening when we examine this world of robots, cyborgs, and artificial intelligence. There are a number of excellent and provocative features we could look at anytime you think about these core themes of future shock coinciding with advanced technology. A pantheon of peak films come to mind. Blade Runner would be one that wrestles with this theme at its core. I would place that as a top 5 future shock film. Another feature that wrestles with this, The Terminator, and subsequently Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And we'll end the conversation there, right? We're not talking about any other sequels. They don't exist, right, in any form or fashion. Only exclusive action figures and posters and that kind of merchandise, right? For the fanatic, for the purists. But those types of films examine the role of artificial life and what it means to be human, and they take it to extreme measures, and very mature cinematic experiences. Tonight we're going to go in a little softer of a direction. As I teased last week, we're going to look at a film that has a sense of irony when it comes to the emotional roles that both people and or android life forms experience and encounter. All right, and for that reason, our feature film in week 3 will be Steven Spielberg's 2001 AI, Artificial Intelligence. Now, Spielberg should be a name that pops in our minds. He's very much tethered to our idea of the modern blockbuster in Hollywood. Spielberg comes of age through myth making, early films in the 1970s, whether it's Duel or his main stage, premiere with Jaws, what some label as that first summertime blockbuster, a movie very much about myth, very much about man versus attempting to tame the beast, right? To conquer that foe, that mythical adversary. And then he finished that decade, well, not with 1941, won't go into that detail, but with Close Encounters of the Third Kind as a foray into science fiction. And this is a director that's revisited science fiction from time to time. In fact, you all have named and identified some of those master texts in which Spielberg left his stroke of artistic merits in the form of E.T., the Extraterrestrial, which was at one time the highest grossing film ever, and a future film with sharing sci-fi roots, Jurassic Park, that we talked about when exploring what are the boundaries of science fiction, and what are its perimeters, and so this is a director that has always been drawn back to that pool. Well, interestingly enough, after or perhaps corresponding with Jurassic Park, the director also began to venture into more serious filmmaking period in his that kind of middle period of the artist's life, with films you at least have heard of, if not seen, such as Schindler's List or Saving Private Ryan, which were big award winners and kind of vaulted for their wartime themes and their excruciating depictions of real life horrors of war, trauma, and so on. And so the director kind of took that turn for a period and became more of that serious storyteller in a cinematic sense. But there was a brief period or window of about a half decade right at the turn of the 21st century, at the twilight of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, where the director returned to these blockbuster roots with a trilogy of what we could consider future shock blockbusters, the first of which was AI, Artificial Intelligence. This film released in 2001, and an important aspect of its history, of which we won't have time for a full review, but an important aspect of it was this was a project he was secretly collaborating on for years with the late Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick, infamous perfectionist film director and auteur, if we want to use that term once again, a master craftsman that has made memorable features like The Shining, perhaps one of the more popular titles, Barry Lyndon, less popular, but maybe the most beautiful work, and notably a pair of sci-fi and or future shock features, A Clockwork Orange from the early mid-70s, and 2001, A Space Odyssey, arguably the most influential science fiction film on modern sci-fi. And so Kubrick had this storied career, and was someone that would process and work through ideas for years until they were kind of matured perfectly to move into a celluloid vehicle, right? And so lore has it that Spielberg and Kubrick, even Spielberg kept a private This is back in the day before cell phones were the ubiquitous form, a private landline phone in his closet that only could go to one number, and it was like a private phone of Stanley Kubrick's. And they would hold these phone calls late at night, exploring the potentialities of this feature. Stanley Kubrick died upon the completing his final release. That would be 1999's Eyes Wide Shut. Film not likely to get shown anytime soon. But perhaps you can locate that elsewhere. A little more of a provocative adult drama. But Kubrick thus passed away before he had the opportunity to collaborate with Spielberg. And Spielberg went on to make and complete this film as the ultimate homage and kind of posthumous collaborative effort, right? And so what you will notice in this feature is it carries a somber tone. And so I want to create that expectation, because I think many times we come into a Spielberg vehicle, we think we're riding a roller coaster, right? We're ready to kind of, whether it's storming Normandy Beach or like Indiana Jones, globe trotting and escaping in a harrowing fashion, or these other kinds of adventurous maneuvers. This is a movie that takes its time to set up, and then very much has a kind of reflective pace. But it is full of rich, striking imagery. And so I would point to imagery, always a key feature in science fiction. I think science fiction emerges as a peak genre when we consider its visuals, the vision casting and world building on that scale. Before we get there, I just want to identify something that stood out to me from this week's readings. I'm going to isolate a single reading and note from Science Fiction Film and Critical Introduction from Keith M. Johnston that chapter 2 backs up in the book for us and examines a bit of a methodological or theoretical chapter. And there's a reason why last week we jumped forward to look at the history of sci-fi. And it is because this is an undergraduate setting, we didn't want you to feel bogged down in what can sometimes be a stuffy theoretical language, or what we call discourse, occurring in early chapters of certain types of books. But we back up this week because there's a really helpful method that's presented. And so what Johnston is doing in that chapter 2 is he's giving us both a little bit of method and also a kind of a literature review of potential ways we can examine science fiction. And I'm just highlighting the 5 types, and he's drawing from another author as well, of approaches to analyzing sci-fi, which could come in handy for our genre comparison paper that we work on toward and by the end of the semester course. And these themes, which are impacting in appropriate detail in the book, include reflection, a reflective approach, ideology or an ideological criticism of science fiction, repression, or using the ideas about repressed ideas rather, to buried within sci-fi, a lens that thinks about the spectator, that thinks about the role we play as audiences of texts, and this idea of intertext or intertextuality, that to study a contemporary text is also to understand and appreciate the texts that came before, the texts that inspire, the moods that are going on around it. And so this can be a very helpful chapter. It just didn't make sense for it to be our earliest exposure in that book. Future Shock weekly themes to cover. We will be wrestling with these themes, borrowing wording verbatim from Alvin Toffler's Future Shock book, as well as documentary on Future Shock that is notably hosted and narrated by the late Orson Welles from the 1970s. just a fascinating artifact that I've located in preparation for this course. And so key future shock themes that I feel resonate with our feature tonight, artificial intelligence, include the age of anxiety and how we are victims of our own technological strength. Something to chew on as you process this film. Second, temporary commitments to people, and I've added, and technology. And this gets back at that idea of disposability as something that's future shock, right? I was just having a conversation this week with someone complaining about, lamenting rather, the state of appliances and how appliances are built not to last anymore, whereas there was once this era where you could buy a dishwasher and count on it for 50 years, and it's just not the same anymore. And so what in a future shock world, if it's about rapidly advancing and accelerating technology and pace of life, what does it look like to live in a world where everything we consume is quickly disposable? Something to process as we work through tonight's film. And finally, this conceptualization, and it should resonate with this in a 2020 setting, that technology outpaces humanity. Okay, so here's our film focus. Things to look out for: robots, cyborgs, and artificial intelligence, right? Those don't bury the lead. It's all in the title, but we're going to get it in some different ways, and I think that's part of the excitement. Technology, possibly as loss of humanity. I think something to weigh constantly is the emotional state of humans versus, and I'm posing a question, the emotional state of artificial beings. We'll see. Also, a core element. This might be an unfamiliar term, but it's worth mentioning. Melancholia, right? This idea of a prolonged and kind of prosaic dread and or depression. And when I say the film is soulful, it has these kind of melancholic moments. And so I think it's valuable to consider that. And then last week we looked at the post-apocalyptic wasteland. I've considered that we keep our eyes peeled for a consumer wasteland, right? Emphasis on waste. And then ultimately, media effects on relationships. I think that's a very contemporary phenomenon. We're worried, we're anxious about how much time we're spending on media, what effect it has on us. And when we think about it, we're often thinking about the prism of the smartphone, the computer, the LED screen, and what have you. And this is a feature that's reframing how we think about technology, perhaps in some haunting ways. So here we go, from 2001, directed by Steven Spielberg, AI, artificial intelligence.